There is a kind of moment that happens in the back of certain old farmhouses across the upland South, and it tends to happen during a renovation. The owners are pulling up a strip of paneling or peeling back wallpaper or pulling out a section of plaster, and they discover that the wall is not actually a wall. It is a tree, a row of them. Behind the wallpaper, instead of studs and sheetrock, is a course of horizontal logs, hewn flat on two faces, notched at the corners with a half-dovetail joint, and chink between with a mixture of clay, straw, and small stones. Above the logs, where a modern house would have a header beam, there is a hand-hewn pine beam, dark with age, smoke-stained at the edges. The owners, if they have not seen this before, do not always know what they are looking at. What they are looking at is the original house. Everything else, the porch, the parlor, the dining room, the bedroom additions on either side, was built around it later. The technical name for what they have discovered is a yeoman farmer's log cabin, and the architectural history community has been documenting these hidden cores in southern farmhouses for half a century. They are everywhere. The Arkansas Historic Preservation Program, in its file on a small farmstead in rural Searcy County, describes one such cabin precisely. The original log section was built in the 1870s. A frame L was added around 1895. The two were unified decades later with simple board and batten siding, so that from the outside it appears to be a single late Victorian farmhouse. The state register lists the property as the Henry Madison Wood Farmstead. For the purposes of this video, the Wood Farmstead is the site. Henry Madison Wood is the name on the deed. What lived inside that 1870s log section from the day it was raised to the day it was paneled over is the subject. This is the story of the house most white Southerners actually lived in for most of the 19th century. It is a story that has been almost entirely covered up by another story. For most of the 19th century, between roughly 1820 and 1900, the dominant dwelling across the upland and backcountry South was not the white-columned plantation house in the magazine spread. It was not the I house with the central hall and the Greek Revival entry. It was a small side-gabled rectangle of horizontal logs, 18 feet by 16 feet, with one stone or brick chimney at one gable end and a single front door. One room, one fireplace, one window, sometimes two. A porch in most cases. Inside, a ladder up to a sleeping loft. That is the entire house. Folk architecture surveys conducted in Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, and the Carolinas during the 20th century reach the same finding repeatedly. In the upland counties of those states, the single-pen log cabin was the most common dwelling type for independent white farmers throughout the 19th century. The dog trot house, with its two pens flanking an open passage, was the second most common. Together, the two forms accounted for the vast majority of Southern domestic architecture for ordinary people. They were the houses where the cooking happened, where the children slept, where the neighbors gathered for raisings and weddings and funerals. Stand inside the loft of one of these cabins on a hot afternoon. The slope of the roof is 2 feet above your head if you sit, 6 inches above your head if you stand. The boards are pine, hand-rived from blocks split with a froe. There is no ceiling under them. The boards are the ceiling. Light comes through narrow gaps where the chinking has shrunk away from the rafters. Below you on the floor of the main room, there is a rope-strung bed against one wall, a cooking hearth at the gable, a table, 2 chairs, a wooden chest, a churn, a row of crocks. That is the house. There is one ladder. It is the only way down. The house has a name in the architectural vocabulary. It is called a single-pen log dwelling. The historian Frank L. Owsley, in Plain Folk of the Old South, called the families who lived in it the plain folk. The white smallholders who owned a piece of land but rarely owned slaves, who raised corn and pork and a little cotton or tobacco, and who, by his estimate, and the estimates of every demographic historian who followed him, made up roughly 4 out of 5 white households in the antebellum South. 4 out of 5. The plantation house was the architecture of 1 out of 5. The dimensions matter because dimensions determine what a life inside a building can look like. 18 feet by 16 feet is 288 square feet. That is approximately the footprint of a modern one-car garage. A typical American suburban primary bedroom in 2026 is around 200 square feet by itself. The yeoman cabin held an entire family in less space than a contemporary master suite. In the early decades of the 19th century, when families were larger, that space might be home to 2 adults and 5 or 6 children, and on some farms, an aged grandparent or an unmarried adult sibling. The architectural historian Henry Glassy, who spent his career measuring small southern log buildings, found that the standard pen size was governed by the practical length of available logs. Logs longer than 20 feet were difficult to handle by hand, so the rooms were the length of a manageable log. Picture the inside of an occupied cabin at sundown. The fire is low, there is a cast iron pot on a swinging crane in the hearth. The mother is at the table cleaning the supper dishes with a rag. 2 of the children are already on the floor, on a pallet of straw and blankets. The infant is in a wooden cradle by the hearth. The father is on the porch, just outside the door, mending a leather harness by the last of the daylight. The oldest girl is up the ladder in the loft, putting the younger boys to bed in the dark. There is no separation. The bed at the back of the room, the cooking hearth at the gable, the children on the floor, all of it is one volume. State surveys of yeoman cabins from the period note that many households had fewer than 3 beds. A 1934 architectural survey of antebellum log dwellings in North Alabama documented family after family in which the bed count was lower than the household count. People shared beds. They slept in pairs and threes. The children rotated between the loft, the floor, and any free pallet that opened up when an older sibling left the household. The yeoman cabin was, in other words, not a house that a modern American would call a house. It was closer in size and function to a pioneer-era one-room schoolhouse, except that the schoolhouse was the work of a community and was occupied during daylight hours, and the cabin was the work of one family and was occupied for every hour the family was alive. The cabin was not designed for privacy, it was not designed for individual rooms, it was designed to keep heat in during winter, to be cheap to build, to be expandable when the family could afford expansion, and to be raised in a single weekend by the men of the surrounding farms. The popular American memory of the 19th century South is a memory built almost entirely from the architecture of the planter class. The Greek Revival mansion with its tall white columns, the brick townhouse on the square in Charleston or Natchez, the neoclassical hall with the curving staircase. These buildings appear in tourism photographs, in Civil War films, in textbook illustrations, in television series, and in countless heritage festivals. They are real buildings, and they were real homes for some of the people who lived in them. But they were a small minority of Southern domestic architecture, and they housed a small minority of Southerners. The numbers, as census historians have reconstructed them, run something like this. In the 1860 census, the year before the Civil War, the South had roughly 9 million people. About 4 million were enslaved African Americans who lived in slave quarter cabins behind the big house. Of the remaining 5 million, only a few percent were planters of the kind whose homes are remembered today. Most owned no enslaved people at all. The vast majority of free white Southerners, somewhere between 70 and 80% depending on which county and which state you measure, lived in single-pen or double-pen log cabins on small farms of fewer than 200 acres. They grew their own corn, they raised pigs and a few cattle, they produced a small surplus of cotton or tobacco for the cash market. These were the people Owsley called the plain folk. They were the demographic majority of the white South. Their architecture was the demographic majority of Southern architecture. Almost none of it survives intact. Almost none of it is photographed in the heritage industry. It is, in the language of architectural history, a vanished form. The vanishing is the central fact about it. By the time the heritage industry came along, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with its colonnaded plantation tours and its lithographed images of Southern domestic life, the houses where most Southerners had actually lived were already disappearing. They were being torn down for lumber, or absorbed into larger frame houses, or slowly collapsing in place. They were not being photographed. They were not being preserved. The picture of the South that survived in the national imagination was the picture of 1 out of 5 households. The other 4 out of 5 lived behind a wall that eventually the wallpaper covered. What did a day in such a house look like? The work was constant. Begin before sunrise. The wife is already up. She is rebuilding the fire from the previous night's embers. She is hauling water from the spring or the well, depending on which was closer. On most upland farms, the spring was 100 yards from the house, down a path the family had worn into the slope. She is heating the water, mixing cornmeal, boiling beans or salt pork. She has been moving for an hour before any of the children are awake. The husband is out of the house by daylight, walking the fence line, checking the stock, sharpening a tool, mending a piece of equipment. The older boys go with him. The younger boys carry firewood. The girls stay with the mother. The cooking hearth is in use most of the day. It does not turn off. The fire is the kitchen, the heater, and the lamp. In summer, the hearth makes the cabin nearly unbearable, which is why so many yeoman cabins evolved into dog-trot houses with detached or breezeway cooking arrangements as soon as the family could afford the second pen. In winter, the same hearth was the only heat source for the entire structure, and the family slept close to it, the youngest children directly in front of the hearthstone where the floor was warm. The work that filled the rest of the day, beyond cooking, was relentless. Spinning, weaving, sewing, mending, churning butter, carrying water, hauling laundry to the creek and back, tending a kitchen garden, putting up vegetables in jars or in a root cellar, salting and smoking pork in the autumn, stripping fodder for the winter, gathering eggs, plucking chickens, killing rats, sweeping, rechinking the gaps between the logs every spring, where the clay and straw had crumbled out over the winter. The architectural historians who later cataloged these cabins concluded that the chinking required maintenance roughly every other year over the building's full life, in a labor cycle that fell mostly on the women of the household. There was no electricity, there was no plumbing, there was no separate kitchen. There was, for most of the century, no formal schooling unless an itinerant teacher passed through and a parent could spare a child for the few weeks the school was held. The work that produced the household, hour by hour, was done by women and children and was visible to anyone who walked up to the porch. What the romantic memory of the cabin obscures is the volume of work, the way the cabin was less a house than a workplace, less a private retreat than a small open factory in which the products were food, cloth, and the next generation of farmers. The yeoman farmer existed in a particular social position. He was not a planter. He was not, except on rare days, an aristocrat. He was, in his own self-understanding and in the rhetoric of 19th century Southern politics, a free man on his own land, beholden to no one, raising what he ate and selling what was left. The cabin he lived in, however small, was a statement. This land is mine. This house is mine. This family is mine. The smallness of the cabin was not an embarrassment. It was, in a strange way, a credential. The plainness of the building demonstrated that the family had not borrowed against its independence to put on airs. The historians who have written about plain folk, beginning with Owsley in the 1940s and continuing through generations of agricultural and social historians, have all found the same thing. These households were proud. They were tight-knit, often related to all their neighbors. They attended evangelical Protestant churches that valued plainness and humility as moral virtues. They distrusted the planter class, whom they considered ostentatious and morally suspect, and they looked down on landless laborers whom they considered improvident. On Sunday mornings, the cabin would be swept and the floors aired. The children's faces would be washed. The family would walk, sometimes a mile or more, sometimes with a wagon, to a wooden church at a crossroads. The preacher would be a circuit-riding minister who came through every 2 or 3 weeks. The sermon would emphasize again and again the moral worth of plain living. After church, the family would walk home, eat the cold supper the wife had prepared the night before, and the men would sit on the porch and the women would sit inside or on the steps, and the children would play in the yard, and the cabin would be the still center of an entire social order. This is the part of the cabin story that the heritage industry, when it noticed the cabin at all, was happy to tell. The cabin as a symbol of plain American virtue. The cabin as the cradle of self-reliance. The cabin as a moral artifact. The story is not entirely wrong. The plainness was real. The pride was real. The labor was real. The mutual aid in raisings and harvest bees and church gatherings was real. But the story is incomplete. It leaves out almost everything that complicates it. A 19th century traveler through the upland South wrote of the small yeoman farmers raising cotton and tobacco that they lived in small log cabins in a squalid yet generally cheerful and carefree existence. The traveler was patronizing, which was the standard tone of an outside observer in those years. But the description of the housing was accurate. Yeoman cabins were often, by the standards of any era, hard places to live. On a cold morning in February, the wind is coming through the gaps in the chinking. The fire is built up. The children are in bed under whatever they can pile on themselves. The mother's hands are cracked from the cold and the lye soap. The father has cut firewood for 2 hours already, and he will cut firewood for 2 more before he eats. There's a chamber pot in the corner. The privy is 20 yards from the back door, across ground frozen rough enough to twist an ankle. There is no insulation. There is, in many cabins of this period, no glass in the window. The shutter is closed against the cold and the room is dark. The romance of the cabin lifestyle did not include the cold. It did not include the absence of medical care. It did not include the infant mortality rate, which on small farms in the upland South in the 19th century was approximately 1 infant in 5, meaning, in practice, that almost every family that survived to fill its loft with grown children had also buried at least one of its babies. It did not include the women whose teeth had failed by their 30s because of pregnancies and inadequate diet. It did not include the children whose growth was stunted by chronic worm infections, a fact documented in 20th century rural health surveys of the same regions, conducted on the same houses, in the lives of children whose parents had been raised in those cabins. And the cabin existed inside an economy that was built, in the lowland South, on enslaved labor. The yeoman farmer was, in the strict sense, free. But his freedom existed on land taken from native nations in a region whose political and economic order rested on a slave system that determined cotton prices, land prices, and credit terms. Some of the smaller yeoman families over the course of the century became small slaveholders themselves, owning 1 or 2 enslaved people who lived in the same 1 or 2 room cabin as the owner's family or in a smaller cabin behind it. The arrangement was rare but documented. The cabin in those cases was not only a yeoman house, it was also, in a small and brutal way, a quarters house. After the Civil War, the situation reversed. As cotton prices fell and small farmers lost land to debt, many former yeoman cabins became tenant houses. The white families who had built them moved into larger frame houses nearby or moved away. The cabins were now occupied by sharecroppers, white and black, working the same land for someone else. The same 18 by 16 room that had stood for the independence of one family now stood for the dependence of another. The architecture had not changed. The position of the architecture inside the social order had changed completely. Return to the wood farmstead in rural Arkansas. The original log section, by the Historic Preservation File's reading of its own evidence, was built in the 1870s, about a decade after the war. It was a single-pen log cabin of the standard upland type. By the 1890s, the family that owned the property had added a frame L on the back, a single-story extension of milled lumber with a kitchen and a second sleeping room. By the early 20th century, when board and batten siding was applied to unify the exterior, the original log walls had been covered. The seam where the log section met the frame addition was buried inside the structure of the house. From the outside, the building now read as a small late Victorian farmhouse with a porch. The wood farmstead is one example of a pattern that played out across the upland South between roughly 1880 and 1920. Sawmills had spread. Railroads had reached most counties. Milled lumber was, for the first time in the rural South, broadly affordable. Families with even modest cash savings could now build, or buy or be built for them, a house with multiple rooms, glass windows, and store-bought trim. The single-pen cabin was no longer the only option. It was no longer the obvious option. It was, in many cases, an embarrassment. Picture the same Arkansas farmstead in the year 1898. The husband has just finished hauling the last of the milled boards from the mill, 10 miles away, in a wagon. The carpenter is sawing them in the yard. The frame L will be added next week. The wife is cleaning out the back wall of the original cabin where the new doorway will be cut. She is taking down the herbs hanging from the rafters. She is taking out the small mirror nailed to the log. She is making room for the saw. A month later, the addition is finished. The family moves the cooking into the new L. The original cabin becomes the parlor, the front room with the door to the porch. A few years after that, the carpenter comes back and applies clapboards over the log walls, inside and out, so that the parlor looks like a parlor and not like a cabin. The logs are still there. They are inside the wall. The family did not remember on every Sunday afternoon that the parlor wall was a log wall. Their grandchildren, growing up in the same house in the 1930s, did not remember it at all. The wallpaper was applied. The cabin became invisible. The cabin, when it is found again, is found by someone with a pry bar. In 1995, an architectural historian working for the Arkansas Historic Preservation Program walked through the wood farmstead with a flashlight. He pulled back a section of paneling in the parlor. He found the logs. He measured them. He photographed the half-dovetail notch at the corner. He wrote the National Register nomination that 3 years later listed the property as a documented example of late 19th century yeoman architecture. The nomination did what architectural history nominations do. It gave the house a date, a category, and a paragraph of context. It did not invent the family. It did not romanticize the building. It simply established that this small farmstead, like hundreds of others across the upland South, was a layered document, and that the bottom layer was the cabin. There are thousands of these layered documents still standing across Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee, the Carolinas, North Georgia, and the Ozarks. Some have been formally listed on state or national registers. Most have not. Some are still occupied by families who have lived in the house for generations and know perfectly well that there are logs in the parlor wall. Most are owned by families who would be surprised to find them. The Robert Scruggs House on Cowpens National Battlefield in upcountry South Carolina is a single-pen log dwelling from the late 1820s, preserved on federal land. It is one of the few yeoman cabins in the South that has been continuously interpreted as a yeoman cabin and not as anything else. Most are not so lucky. Most have either been absorbed into larger houses like the wood farmstead, or torn down, or moved to outdoor heritage museums where they are interpreted as pioneer artifacts in a generic frontier village arrangement. The Museum of Appalachia in East Tennessee, founded by John Rice Irwin in the 1960s, contains 35 such buildings on a single property, salvaged from the surrounding counties before they could be lost. Visitors walk through them and read the small interpretive signs. The signs say what the buildings were. The signs do not say how many of them there once were. The most accurate way to understand the yeoman cabin is to understand that it was the dominant southern domestic form of the 19th century, that it housed a majority of the white population for most of the century, and that it has been almost entirely erased from the popular picture of the era. The plantation house has dominated the imagination because the plantation house survived in numbers, in photographs, in films, and in a tourism economy. The cabin did not survive in numbers. It survived in fragments, behind wallpaper, in the back of farmhouses, in salvaged museum pieces. What the disappearance of the cabin tells us is something specific about how a culture remembers itself. It tells us that what gets remembered is what gets photographed and preserved, and what gets photographed and preserved is what its contemporaries thought worth photographing and preserving. The cabin was not thought worth photographing. The cabin was the room where most people lived. The cabin was the floor, the hearth, the sleeping pallet, the chinking that needed repacking every spring. It was the room in which most Southerners washed dishes, raised children, slept, fought, and died between 1820 and 1900. It was for most of the century the actual house of the actual South. The wood farmstead is still standing in Searcy County, Arkansas. The 1870s log core is still inside the wall. The porch has been rebuilt, the roof has been replaced, the chinking is gone, sealed over by the surrounding frame structure. From the road, the building looks like an ordinary small Victorian farmhouse, with a tin roof and a screened porch. Walk up to it on a still summer evening. The fields around the house have grown back into pine. There is no one farming the land. The smokehouse is gone, the foundation stones are still there, in a small rectangle of grass 20 yards from the back door. The privy is gone, the spring house is gone, the barn is gone, the well is capped. What is left is the farmhouse itself. Inside the parlor, behind a section of paneling that the preservation file dates to about 1910, is a wall of horizontal pine logs, half dovetailed at the corner, chinked with a clay and straw mortar that is now dry and crumbling but still in place. This is the actual material of the actual house in which an actual family lived for 30 years before the addition was built. The walls are the original walls. The notches are the notches a man cut by hand in 1872 or 1873 with an axe. The chimney stones on the gable end are stones taken from the field on which the man and his sons were trying to grow corn that year. The family that lived there did not write a memoir. They were not photographed. The 1870 and 1880 censuses list the household, the children's names, the husband's occupation as farmer, the wife's occupation, in the standard 19th century language as keeping house. That is the entire surviving record of who they were. The architecture is the rest of the record. The yeoman cabin disappeared, and most Southerners who built and lived in cabins disappeared from popular memory along with it, because the people who romanticized the South later were not interested in their houses. The story of the South that survived was the story of the columns, the verandas, the staircases, the carriage drives. The other story, the one inside the wallpaper, was the story of 4 out of 5. The empty paneling at the front of the wood farmstead, with the logs hidden behind it, is one of the only places left to see that story plainly. Stand close to the wall and you can hear the chinking shift when the wind moves the house. The cabin is still inside the cabin. It does not announce itself. You have to know where to look.